Ben. So I was wondering, so most like the safe space, like trigger warning culture, I think right now we can see it's like sort of centered on, like the college like bubbles, like on campuses. But do you see kind of like the left changing once these people, that are around our age start, becoming the politicians, start becoming the people in power? Do you think we're going to see anything drastically different than we do today from the left?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we are one justice away from hate speech codes being upheld by the Supreme Court. I think the left has moved very fast to the left. I mean, this is why you'll notice that throughout the speech I use the word left. I don't use the word liberal. I don't think they're the same thing. I think the old school liberals have been wiped out by the left, or they are in the process of being wiped out by the left. People like Larry Summers, right, who was a Clinton Secretary of the Treasury, was ousted at Harvard for saying true things about discrepancies in hiring between women and men in sciences, and because he believed in the notion that you should be able to say these things. Right? He was ousted from Harvard because that wasn't sufficiently leftist. There's a new wave of the left that is significantly less interested in free speech. Liberals used to say, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll die for your right to say it. Now it's, I may disagree with what you have to say, and if I have the chance, maybe I'll kill you. And I think that is bleeding upward. I don't think it's bleeding downward. I don't think it's going to stop when people exit college. If you've created a safe space for yourself, why wouldn't you attempt to perpetuate that beyond your current safe space into the broader panoply of American activities?
Thank you so much.
So as a Christian, I don't support gay marriage, and I definitely don't support gay adoption. And I was just wondering what your argument, or what your view on gay couples adopting is, when the left says that it's better for them to be adopted than stay in foster care or be orphans.
Right, that's called a false choice. There are significantly more couples, married heterosexual couples, who are looking to adopt than there are children who are looking to be adopted in the United States. The adoption system is a complete disaster. I believe that every child deserves a mother and a father. The answer to the adoption crisis is to make a more streamlined adoption system, not to broaden the categories. By the way, I feel the same way about single people adopting. I think every kid deserves a mother and a father, end of story. So, again, I'm with you. I agree.
Thank you.
Hey, Ben, thank you for coming. So I brought a liberal friend to come listen to you speak today.
Oh, good. That's nice.
She made me sit next to a Bernie Sanders supporter during a dinner, so...
Retaliation, yeah.
It's only fair.
Revenge.
So on the way over here, we got in a discussion about the wage gap between men and women.
Yes.
And she was saying that in a corporate setting even, that a woman entering the same time as a man is getting paid less for the exact same job. And since I was driving, I couldn't just stop and scream at her, but this is wrong. But what was your opinion on this?
I mean, it's not my opinion. It's statistical fact. This is bullshit. Okay, the 78 cents on the dollar myth is just that. It's a myth. Time magazine actually found as early as 2010 that in the 50 biggest cities in the United States, women were actually earning more than men. If they had the same job qualifications, the same number of years in the workforce, the same number of hours worked, the reason that women on average are paid less is because women take time off, they take less risky jobs, they don't take as much time at work, they would rather be home with their families. These are choices that women make, and it's astonishing to me that feminists actually degrade those choices as though it's a terrible thing when a woman takes time off. Well, it's her choice. I mean, I thought that was your whole deal. My wife is a perfect example of this. My wife is a doctor, right? She's just graduating from UCLA Medical School. She finished all of her classes. She's just graduating in about 6 weeks. And she's doing 5, so we'll see if she's having our second baby in 5. So we'll see if she's able to walk up to the podium. But she took a year off during medical school because when we had our first kid, she wanted to take a year off to be with our first child, right? That was her choice. I took off 4 days, right? That's relatively typical because men are not the ones, for a variety of reasons, including how much they want to do it. Men are typically not the ones in the home. And by the way, I'm speaking as somebody who, when I was growing up, my dad was a stay-at-home dad and my mom worked. Right, so I'm fine with whatever choices women want to make about work versus home life. I think there are certain choices that are more or less beneficial to the child. But to pretend that these discrepancies don't exist across the broad class of women is just not true. It's just not true. And it's not society's fault that women are given this, as Gavin McInnes says, this magical superpower of being able to create other humans, which is unbelievable and cool. Right, and it's now been seen as some sort of horrible affliction by so many women. It is the coolest thing literally on planet Earth from my perspective that women can do this. It's unbelievable. And, you know, and being able to recognize that and then say that women are able and free to make the choice to engage with that and enjoy it and be part of that, you know, that's an aspect of freedom. So if women are being paid less on average, it's because women want to be paid less on average. And if they didn't, they would be in the workforce the same amount as men, and they would be 40, and they would be unmarried, and they wouldn't have kids, and they'd be miserable. Right? Because men who do the same thing are generally 40, unmarried, don't have kids, and are miserable. Right? Being a workaholic has its downsides, in other words. But the workaholic skews some of the statistics. And again, men don't have to take time off for childbirth. Men can't nurse, unless you're Michael Moore. And it's... So that's the reason. Don't buy into the myth. If it were really true that women were paid so much less on average than men because there is this vast discrimination, then why wouldn't corporations, these greedy, evil corporations, the same ones that have the Scrooge McDuck money bins, why wouldn't they fire all the men and hire all the cheap women? Right? Why wouldn't they just staff up with women? They're willing to do the same work for 78 cents on the dollar. They don't do that. Why? Because it's not true. Thank you. Looking for that.
For coming today. Our university really needs this. I was wondering if you could talk on how the left has dominated in the social aspects of politics and how the right really doesn't try to, they just focus on economics, but the left keeps hammering, saying we need to change the morals of society, we need to change these things. Mm-hmm. So how can the right combat this?
Well, I mean, I've mentioned Jonathan Haidt before. He has a very good book called The Righteous Mind, about the various aspects of moral drive and what drives us as human beings to be interested in morality. The left bases almost its entire argument on fairness. It's always fairness. It's fairness this and fairness that. But they're always framing their questions in ways that benefit them. I think that it's been a big mistake for the right to abandon the social playing field, because I think that social policy helps define, you know, who we are. By the way, I tend to be extremely libertarian when it comes to government policy. So, for example, gay marriage, right? I'm not libertarian on abortion because murder is murder, and the government prosecutes murder whether that human is in your womb or whether the human is outside your womb. But when it comes to same-sex marriage, I'm actually libertarian, and the reason I'm libertarian is because I think the government basically sucks at everything. And so the government's idea of we're going to forward straight marriage was obviously a failure. And what I don't want is a government that crams down its perceptions of what relationships ought to be on religious people, which is what's going to happen now that same-sex marriage has been you know, made mandatory at the state level in terms of legalization across the country. So I agree that we shouldn't run from social issues. I think that what it really boils down to is that every issue for the left is a moral issue, as I said before. Everything is a moral issue. It's not an evidence-based argument. It's not an efficiency-based argument. The right loses because the left argues morality. Every Bernie Sanders tweet, all of them, are, this person is rich and this person is poor. That is wrong, right? That's right, and then he plays the air bongos for a little while, and then we all move on. But every argument for the left is a fairness, equality, morality argument. The left and the right always comes back with, that's just not efficient. It's just not effective. And you're going to lose arguments when you argue that way. So particularly on social policy, I think that the right has some strong points to make. And I think it's a mistake to run away from those. I think that what really goes to is fear. I think that people on the right know the arguments. They're just afraid to make them because they're afraid of being called intolerant. But it seems to me significantly more intolerant for people to suggest that the government should force a religious Christian baker to cater a gay wedding than it is to suggest that I personally don't have to accept the legitimacy of your marriage. Right? My personal intolerance is one thing. My personal decision that I don't like what you're doing is one thing. You don't have to care. Once whoever calls the government guns first is essentially the fascist. Right? When it comes to issues like this. And I think that's how we ought to argue them.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm just curious, after making your 2014 video about how you say there's no such thing as a moderate Muslim, how can you go...
That's not what it says, by the way, but yes.
Well, it's a minority is what you're saying.
I said there's a myth that it's only a tiny minority of Muslims who are radicalized. It's called the myth of the radical Muslim minority, the tiny radical Muslim minority.
So you still say there's that sizable portion that does have these radicalized views.
Sure.
You say that in the video. How can you attack Donald Trump for taking this immigration stance that combats that and that understands that until we get the whole situation sorted out over there?
Okay, the reason that I don't agree with Donald Trump's Muslim immigration ban, and I said this at the time, is because it is not specific enough. Meaning that, number one, it's slightly impractical in that you can't tell who's a Muslim and who is not when you let people in. But beyond that, my care is not whether someone prays 5 times a day toward Mecca. Who am I to criticize? I pray 3 times a day toward Jerusalem, right? Like, that's not my business. There are other things that we should be looking for. Namely, for example, a form of radicalized Islam, refusal to accept Western values. I think that we should have very broad standards, by the way, of what prevents you from entering the country. And those extend far beyond religion. So in some ways, I actually think that Trump was being too specific and yet too overbroad at the same time. Like, there are Muslim members of the American military, obviously. There are moderate Muslims who do exist in the world. And I think that his blanket ban is not well calibrated, particularly because we do have intelligence resources inside the Muslim American community and the European Muslim community and abroad, and you're going to damage those intelligence capabilities if you suggest that nobody can even come into the country. With that said, I am for very significant restrictions on immigration generally that don't have to do with religious Muslim practice. Right? So be more specific about what you're looking for, in other words. So, for example, a better measure of whether you should let someone into the country would be place of origin, actually, as opposed to religious practice. So, for example, if the person is from Syria right now, that person should get more scrutiny than if you are a Muslim who's residing in Dearborn. Right? I mean, just as an example, right? Because by polls, American Muslims are significantly more moderate than Muslims who are living in Syria. So, you know, I think that we should be more specific than that. I also think that Trump has a habit of saying the loudest thing possible without really thinking about it, and then walking it back. And he has walked it back. I mean, he started off with no Muslims will enter the country at all, including people who are on vacation. And then he walked that back, right? And then he said his very rich Muslim friends will come into the country. He said that on MSNBC last week. So this is not this is not a well-calibrated immigration policy, in other words. I think that we should be highly skeptical of anybody who wants to come in the country. We ought to make sure that they have our values, and we should make sure that they're not leeching off our economic system. But I think you can do better than, well, what's the gauge? Like, as soon as you find out that somebody prays 5 times a day toward Mecca, they don't come in. That seems, again, overbroad to me.
Thank you.
Good. I just want to talk to you about a question I have. How do I defeat the minimum wage argument about continuing to raise it as they have done just previously in California?
The people who are suggesting minimum wage don't know anything about business or economics. And minimum wage invariably minimum wage is supposed to be an economic decision, but it's predicated largely on a moral vision of the world that is false. And that is that somewhere these business people who are engaged in competition with each other with ever shrinking profit margins, somewhere the McDonald's owner in his back room has a giant Scrooge McDuck money bin filled with gold. And each night he goes there and he just swims around in it, right? And he's preventing all of his hard laborers who are flipping burgers from earning their rightful $200,000 a year. And so we need a minimum wage. The point, the problem with minimum wage, and the reason it's economically ignorant, is because competition in wages leads to lower wages, right? That's what it does. Just as competition in products leads to lower prices for the products. You artificially increasing the price of labor, all that does is it cuts out the profit margin, and it means that somebody is going to have to be fired, right? This is every time minimum wage is tried, there is, if you get rid of the confounds, there is a net loss in employment because. As we all know, if you only have $30 to spend on your employees, and right now you're paying them each $10 a head, if you'd raise that to $15 a head, you have to lay somebody off, right? Somebody has to get fired. Beyond that, it's pushing up the unemployment rate, particularly among the people who need those part-time jobs and those low-wage jobs. The people who disproportionately staff part-time and low-wage jobs are young minority folks, right? And those people, their unemployment rate is soaring right now because if I'm going to pay $15 an hour for a burger flipper, he also better be able to recite cons. I mean, he better have another skill set, right? Because it turns out that anybody with a functioning radial bone and a prefrontal cortex can flip a burger. It's not that hard a job, right? It's an entry-level job, which isn't to say it is honorable to work, but let's not pretend that you're curing cancer here, right? Which is the reason why people who actually try to cure cancer get paid more. So the idea of minimum wage is foolish. The easiest way to debunk this is to say, okay, you say it should be a $15 minimum wage. I'll agree with you. It should be, I say it should be a $2,000 minimum wage. $2,000 an hour. Why not? These people have money in the back room, right? They've got that Scrooge McDuck money, but we know that they're gypping people. We know that they've got this money hanging around. Where are you coming up with this $15 an hour number? I mean, is it straight from your colon, or does it pass through the small intestine first? Like, what? You know, the problem with the minimum wage is that, for the left, every argument is a moral argument, not an economic argument, so you have to take the morality of the argument away. It is beyond that, there is a fundamental argument here. It is fundamentally immoral for you to come in and tell somebody that they are not allowed to make a free and binding contract. Okay, no one is being chained to their grill. If somebody doesn't want to work for that wage, they can leave. Right? And who are you to tell the 17-year-old black kid who wants to work for $7.50 an hour that he is forbidden by law from taking a job at $7.50 an hour? Who are you to do that? Right? This makes you a totalitarian. It's a totalitarian rule. So that's the way I would argue against it.
Thank you, sir.